Welcome to Why Are We Afraid to Judge, this opening keynote at the Battle of Ideas 10. I'm Claire Fox, I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, and the theme of this year's festival that resonates at least in a third of the sessions that you might go to is the theme of judgment. People might wonder why we're doing this, and hopefully it'll just kind of infiltrate its way throughout the festival. But the theme of judgment was really brought home to me, or the dilemmas around it, this week when I was speaking at a conference on the liberal arts and the need for liberal arts in education. And one of the speakers argued the need for student-led degrees. The academics said that actually students needed to be able to choose what their degree comprised of, because that meant that they would really enjoy their studies. And it was hard to know whether that was a kind of victory for the judgment of students and 18-year-olds, or an abdication of the judgment of academics, that they were handing over that very important decision to young people who maybe weren't in as good a position to decide as their betters. And I say that provocatively, and I mean it. The proposition of this session is that we live in a period of non-judgmentalism, and that's not such a good thing, that judgment, cultural, moral, political, often stands accused of being subjective and elitist. And in the blurb for the session on the website, it starts off with a quote from the Pope saying, "Who am I to judge?" Which it is rather extraordinary, because if the Pope says, "Who am I to judge?" then you really have to say that judgment is in something of crisis. It's more often said to us, "But who are you to judge?" If you actually try and make a judgment of something, people will say, "Well, who are you? You can't say that. I mean, your opinion is no more important than anyone else." And that can be said to those people who are experts, people who know a lot about, say, the arts or so on, but they can be told, "Well, you know, my opinion is just as valid as yours." So it's those kind of things we want to look at. But there's also a kind of weird dichotomy, which is that people defer to others' judgments all the time. These days, people are prepared to say, "Well, you know, it's up to experts to decide how we live our lives," or, "Well, never mind using our moral judgment. Let's look at the evidence, let's look at the stats, let's look at the science," some kind of objective criteria. And that can mean that we can avoid making judgments for ourselves. So these are the kind of issues that we want to raise. There's a little quote in Rebecca's book here, which you should all buy and read. There's a nice bit in it where Marcus, a software engineer, says to Plato, you have to get the gist of this, but anyway, "Who are these philosophers to tell people how to live? I asked him in no uncertain terms, who are they to tell me how to live? It's my life, and I think I know what makes it worth living, better than any expert in philosophy does." Now, that's partly a way of setting up the fact that these are not our philosopher kings or our experts on the panel. They are, and have been asked, and they're very kindly agreed to do it, to just kick us off with a provocation. Really, this is a public conversation, and if you haven't been to the Battle of Ideas, the format is thus, that we ask our speakers to speak for 5 or 6 minutes each. We'll then have a quick chat, but really it's to open up a conversation with you. It is not a series of lectures about how to live the good life, but a series of thoughts and people who have thought about it a lot, but to open it up to all of us. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. So I'm delighted to welcome back to the Battle of Ideas John Waters, who is best known as a newspaper columnist and author in Ireland, and has become something of a popular speaker over the last few years. His most recent book is "Was It For This? Why Ireland Lost the Plot?" He's very much a free thinker and challenger of orthodoxies, which is why he's here. He's also a playwright and a songwriter, allegedly. Because infamously, in 2007, he co-wrote a song that came last in Eurovision. I can't decide whether that means that it was good or bad, which shows you the crisis of judgment in the music world at the very least.
If you're slagging Eurovision, it's got to mean good.
Yeah, and he has a single honour of having achieved no less than 3 entries in Private Eye's Sude's Corner for the same article. In 2004 in The Guardian, but it was an article that gave a plea for U2 to call it a day for the love of God. So you can see what kind of character he is. Can we give him a warm welcome, please?
Thank you.
Next up, we will be hearing from Angus Kennedy, who is the convener of the Institute of Ideas educational initiative, the Academy, which was established in 2011 as a modest attempt to demonstrate over 4 days of reading and discussion what university should be like and isn't. And if you haven't been to the Academy, you should find out about it because it really is intellectually exhilarating and important. Angus is also the author of Being Cultured in Defence of Discrimination, which is an inspiration really not just for this session but for many of the sessions at the festival and on the arts, and is a book which is a provocation in its own right and is one of the books that made my head hurt from reading it and arguing with it and agreeing with it. So that means it's a good book. Over recent years he has helped convene the Battle of Ideas, and one of his big arguments is around the philosophy of freedom which he's developed, and we're delighted to have him on this opening plenary. Can we give him a warm welcome, please? Next up will be Professor Rebecca Newberger-Goldstein, or Goldstein. Yes, we've decided that I just can't speak. Anyway, we're delighted that Rebecca is here from Massachusetts. She's an acclaimed novelist and philosopher, and she is taking Plato on tour, effectively, through her book. She went to great lengths to organise to be at the Battle of Ideas because it didn't quite fit in with her book schedule, and I just wanted to say now that we're delighted to have you, and she's going to be finishing off the festival at the very important plenary about why we need philosophy now more than ever, which is wonderful that we have her for that, but we thought it was great that she could top and tail the festival, so she's with us now to open it as well. Rebecca has been the recipient of the MacArthur, Guggenheim, Radcliffe Fellowships. She has been designated Humanist of the Year and a free thought heroine. In 2005, elected as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Only this year, in August, she received the Richard Dawkins Award at the Atheist Alliance of American Convention. And her latest book, Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away, is the book that you have to read. We're delighted to have you here. Can we give her a warm welcome? And last but not least is Paul Morley, acclaimed English music journalist. Many of us have known him as a regular and often the most insightful of guests on BBC's review show, which in a matter of poor judgment, the BBC have obviously closed down because it was one of their better shows. He's more broadly a TV presenter. He's written for the NME, which he wrote for in the 70s and 80s. He's been a band manager and a promoter, and his books include Words and Music, A History of Pop in the Shape of a City, and most recently, The North and Almost Everything in It, which was last year the subject of a Bookshop Barney Battle Satellite, at which I heard him speak, and I just knew then that I really wanted him to speak at the Battle of Ideas Festival itself. We're delighted that he's here. Can we give him a warm welcome as well, please? Okay, John, kick us off, please.
Okay. There's a distinction we need to make, first of all, between judgment and judgmentalism. I think very often we confuse the two. I think there's lots of judgmentalism around, and judgmentalism is a different thing to judgment. Judgment is a process which is, I believe, embedded in the human person, a capacity to look deeply into things, into anything, whether it's a piece of music or a moral idea. And judgmentalism is simply something else. It's importing a judgment from elsewhere because that judgment kind of put you in tune with the common mentality, with conventional society. I think that's on the increase, and true judgment is on the decrease because of the kind of culture we're generating. I want to nail one thing about Pope Francis and this question of who am I to judge. I'm sorry to say that my colleagues in the media have somewhat distorted what he said on that occasion, because he was actually talking about a specific case and a specific man, Monsignor Rica. He was asked a particular question about this priest and his past life, and he simply said that, well, if the man has repented and been forgiven for his sins by Christ, who am I to judge? So he wasn't making a broader statement, although, and in a way that kind of is part of what we're talking about, because we're constantly being told of the necessity to be non-judgmental and that non-judgmentalism is a good thing. And in a certain sense, I personally believe it is a good thing for me. You know, it's a good thing if I can live the kind of life I want to live and be completely free to do what I want to do. But you can't actually have a non-judgmental society, because if everybody else does that, my life will be hell. So I'm really against that in other people. But I'm in favour of total freedom for myself and a little bit less freedom for you, if you don't mind. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, there is something here. What is judgment? When we compare something, it's a comparison. There's something in us. When we hear a piece of music, you know, when you hear a song and it hits you and you think it's this incredible song. And so it's saying something to you. You've already heard it in a certain sense. It resonates. It's a kind of a nostalgia that it triggers off in you, a memory or something. There's certainly a comparison, but comparison with what? You haven't heard it before, or have you? And it seems to be a great, great song, but it's never a perfect song. There's something in you that tells you, if you were writing this song, if you could write songs, you would write it better than this. But it'll do. It's okay. It's good. And you like to listen to it. Maybe precisely because all the time you hear it, each time you hear that perfect version or some pre-echo of that perfect version. So there's a judgment all the time in everything you hear, which is to measure against something else. And I believe that thing is a measure of perfection, a measure of an infinite perfection, which is a kind of a long, long line, an infinite line, obviously. And the kind of comparison that we make, I think very often we think, you know, if I hear a great song, and more this is true, we kind of assume that it's kind of up there, maybe up to sort of 99 points on the Richter scale of perfection. But in fact, it's probably only, you know, in the 0000. So, you know, so our sense of perfection is unlimited. And we have a minor kind of sense, measurable, which sounds great. So that we kind of have all this kind of language now that we use. And it's become more and more prevalent, you know, like the word, in an era when God is kind of being sort of eliminated, the phrase, oh my God, has acquired a new significance. You know, we kind of say, oh my God. And that actually itself is an attempt to measure a kind of, to sort of reflect a kind of an intensity, moving towards infinity. The great text on judgment in our time is this book, I believe, Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, because she sets out at a time when, before maybe all of these kind of things really became cultural, she sets out the basic conditions in the Eichmann trial in 63, I think it was. So she talks about the court, she talks about Eichmann, she talks about the condition that was put on trial. She talks about what was missed, what was kind of not judged, what was misjudged. And she believes that Eichmann was misjudged, not because he wasn't innocent. He wasn't innocent, she never said that, but that he was judged for the wrong things. And, you know, of course he was guilty of something, of lots of stuff, but he wasn't guilty of what he was being indicted for. In other words, he had never killed anybody, he had never ordered anybody to be killed, yet he had been engaged in the mass transportation of Jews and was in that sense wholly guilty. But the point she was making was that in the trial there was an evasion of the real nature of Eichmann's evil, that it was a much more banal evil, the banality of evil. It was an ordinary evil. It wasn't the sense that we wanted to create of a kind of a great criminal conspiracy, an aberration, some kind of extreme, exceptional event that couldn't really be compared with anything else in the human, which it couldn't at that point in human history. But her point was that actually, by letting Eichmann off the hook in terms of the true nature of his evil, of his wrongdoing, the banality of it, she said that Eichmann never had uttered a sentence in his life that wasn't a cliche. And she pinned it down to this sense that Eichmann was incapable of conducting a dialogue with himself, that everything he said had come to him from somewhere else, and he just simply regenerated it. And I think this is absolutely the key to this distinction that I make between judgment and judgmentalism, that judgment is something which is internal. It has got to do with some internal imprint. Judgmentalism comes from ideas of ideology, of culture, of attitude, of opinion. And simply, we, in a certain sense, we compile ourselves in modern society in the same way as we dress. with opinions. You know, we add a little bit here and a little bit there. You know, I'm a free-thinking atheist, pro-gay marriage. You know, it's like I wear a different kind of scarf. I wear different kind of earrings, accessories. That's kind of what judgmentalism has become. I think that's the nature of our judging process in modern society. The true process of judging requires something else. And I just want to talk briefly about that, because it's this imprint I talk about, this kind of sense of a scale towards perfection that is imprinted on each one of us, each person. Where does it come from? It seems to be there. It seems to have been pre-existed. We know, I mean, Hannah Arendt talks about this, that, you know, the law only reflects what is in here. And if it doesn't reflect that, we know. And the problem in Nazi Germany was that the law had come to reverse that. It took the commandment, thou shalt not kill, and turned it into thou shalt kill. And therefore, everybody in that culture was convinced that the rightness and their consciences, in other words, were marshalled to the idea of doing evil. And that this became a huge problem. And you can see that in a society which is incapable of judging, but which has become highly judgmental, as Nazis were of Jews, for example, then there's a huge danger to the human person. So this is it. So there are two fundamental problems, I think, first of all, with judging. One is this idea, you know, who am I to judge? Which is, it kind of goes back to that Copernican idea of mediocrity, you know, that we are not, after all, the center of the universe. Therefore, we're nothing. We're just here by accident. That's one thing. The other question, the other element is, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. And in a certain sense, this is a great alibi for everybody now, because in a certain sense, we're not there. We're never there. And I don't mean just physically there, but there's a certain sense in which increasingly our culture has come to believe that we are not here, because the self is actually, as neuroscience is increasingly attempting to tell us, although fraudulently I believe, that there is no self, there is no inner, there's no person. There's simply a random kind of a succession of different functions, brain functions, crisscrossing and creating an illusion, a kind of a hologram, which increasingly science will find is a kind of an illusion, that the human person is an illusion. The point I want to come to is this, and I'll develop it later because Claire's asked me to start. This imprint is something which I think we have deliberately avoided for a series of reasons to do fundamentally with a word which I hesitate to use in this company. And it's a three-letter word called God. And the problem with this word is, of course, because once you hear it, everybody starts shrieking and thinking they know what I mean. I mean God as, let's say for today, I mean God as something that used to function to make certain things easy, to make certain measure of certain things easy. God is a concept by which we measure. I'll say it again. God is a concept by which we measure. Measure beauty, measure right and wrong. That was an easy way. So everybody could carry that in their pocket one time. Once you start to diminish that, you do all kinds of things to the human person. Leave aside what happens up there in the sky. You start affecting the ecology of the human person. And this actually has increasingly making us vacate this idea of the I, the personal, the self, the subjective self. And it is from this that the problem of judging arises. Because if there is nobody there, there's nobody to judge. And if there's nobody over there, there is nobody to be judged. And this is a great problem in the future. We say if we have a society in which there is no self, there will be a really serious dilemma as to whether or not we can actually hold anybody responsible for anything, because they were just a mechanical apparatus walking across the face of the earth with no moral responsibility. So moral responsibility will become a necessary fiction. It will have to be enshrined in law. But that's what the Nazis did. They enshrined something in law that wasn't true. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Plenty on the table there to come back on. Not just the God question, but the vacation of self. Loads of interesting ideas on the table now. So, Angus, your thoughts, please.
Well, I'm very grateful to John for getting the God word out there, because I plan to mention him with some due trepidation, but he's out on the table now, so that makes my job a little bit easier. But I was also going to start with something else that John had mentioned, which is the problem, or the possibility, I suppose, that results from the accidental miracle of being here. And when we go up on a hill and look out and look down from that viewpoint, we're taking in or taking a view on the world laid out below us. And we establish a point of perspective and distance from which to take that view. The view is created by our being there at that point, by having that perspective. And it is my view. And I judge whether or not it is a good or a bad view. I make an aesthetic judgment on the view. In my case, the view is from the South Downs down onto that eco-paradise that is Brighton. And that view, my view, the view that my being there has created, is something that I judge. And judgment then, I think, is something that relies upon my having a certain unique perspective and a certain distance from the object of judgment, a distance on which that perspective itself relies. It relies too on a certain stillness, I think. If you're running or cycling along the South Downs, as increasingly is the case, you don't really have any free time to take in that view. You're instead in a position of being reactive to reality. You're trying to avoid the stone in the path or the grazing cow, say, knowing that if you cycle while trying to take in the view and make an aesthetic judgment, you may find yourself rather closer to the view than you'd hoped. But having a perspective, however, is a matter of not reacting to reality. Rather, it is a perspective on a possibility. It's a creative relationship to the world in which judgment, in order to be judgment, has to be underpinned by a freedom to judge this way or that way. And if judgment lacked that freedom, as in the case of the necessity of avoiding the stone to avoid injury, then judgment would be determined and lack the character of a judgment, which we know, say, in the law, can go for or against you, for good or for ill. I suppose this week's example of what happens if we lack that freedom to judge is Judy Finnegan and her comments, her judgment on the Ched Evans rape case. And she and her family have been slammed and trolled for her comment that the rape was non-violent and that he had served his time. Now look, given that Judy Finnegan is, of course, a literary critic of some note, she's not a famous world legal expert. And you think she might be able to have that sort of judgment on the case without it being a threat to the very fabric of civilized society. But no, the view that rape is one of those areas of life now that is beyond judgment. It's interesting to note that the judgment of the law itself and the reaction to the Finnegan comments is what's being condemned. That legal judgment was not that Evans should never be allowed to work again. Sadly, Finnegan has been forced to apologise for having an opinion that doesn't fit the new post-feminist orthodoxy. And it's that underpinning of judgment by freedom, I think, that we recognise when we speak of divine judgment, the ability to play God, to judge as one sees fit. God's judgment, of course, is absolute, because his freedom is absolute. Our judgment is always relative and constrained, no doubt, but it is not determined. When we take a God's eye view on the world from the top of the hill, or when we stand in front of a beautiful picture, or listen to a piece of music, we feel that freedom in us to respond to the view or to the work of art, and to judge it. It almost demands that response from us. And judgment seems to lie in that relationship between a free subject and the object it regards. So for Aristotle, the capacity of right judgment, phronesis, was a key capacity of man in that it captured the ability of human subjects to determine what was good in terms of a mean relative to oneself, to one's own perspective. But in times when we are less sure maybe or less confident in our subjectivity, in our ability to make good judgments, or what amounts to the same thing, less confident of our freedom, then the balance of judgment in society, I think, starts to shift. From being determined by discriminating subjects to being determined instead by objects. Rather than the subject determining the object, we look to the object to determine the subject. Reality maps out our choices rather than we stamp them on the world. We do not so much spin webs, but find ourselves caught in webs not of our own choosing. Now, an example might be scientific prescription. Salt in just these exact quantities meets the requirements of a body's health, this much and no more. Instead, rather, of one adding salt to one's food to one's own taste. An example from the arts could be that the worth of a picture is determined not by its beauty, but rather by what it is about. This, then, is a bad picture if you're a feminist artistic critic. It's a bad picture because it portrays a woman in a domestic situation. or this is a bad picture because it shows a man in armor on horseback, instead of being something that would be judged by a connoisseur of fine art. And an example maybe from the political sphere, not that there's much in the way of good judgment on display in those areas these days, but an example might be found in the ongoing debate about immigration. And often the liberal defense of immigration is that immigrants are good for the economy. Well, so would slavery be good for the economy in the short to medium term, at least, but that doesn't make it a good thing either. And when Nigel Farage pointed out in a BBC interview recently that some things are more important than economics, things like preserving the way of the life of a people, for example, there was predictable liberal shock and outrage. So used, I think, of people come to making evidence-based judgments, to listening to what the science says, that when somebody refuses to play that game and says, look, I don't care if leaving Somalis in Calais is bad for the economy, instead I judge preserving Britishness or whatever it is to be more important, then the reaction tends to be a knee-jerk denial of the very validity or possibility of somebody having that sort of judgment. The reaction is, that's not a thought you can have. The reaction is always, you can't say that. The reaction is to say that judgments that aren't determined by a supposed set of facts are not judgments at all, which of course I think is to deny the freedom of the judge, and which is why we hear all the time, as Claire mentioned, the phrase, who are you to play God, whenever somebody disagrees with whatever the orthodoxy is. Now for myself, I'll finish here, for myself I would rather not live in a world so much determined by objects, in a world in which I have to be reactive to reality, but in a world made by subjects for subjects. Subjects who take a view on the world and judge it to be good or not, judge what they see to be good or not, and act to improve it when they find it wanting. Now, if that's playing God, then I think we could do with rather more people who are willing to go up onto mountaintops and decide how things should be for themselves.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Angus. Certainly lots of provocation again, but also introducing an important theme of this, which is also about things like aesthetic judgment, because one of the areas that this comes up a lot is in relation to music criticism, art criticism, and so on. So it's a kind of wide panoply that we're looking at here, but that was very useful, and we'll come back to some of the themes. Okay, Rebecca, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. So I wish that there were actually more fear of judgment than there is, if in fact that fear came out of was an acknowledgement of how difficult and what a responsibility it is to judge. You've brought up aesthetics, and morality is what I really want to to concentrate on here, although I've got things to say about both, and maybe we can come back to aesthetics later. I would want to argue, as any good Platonist would, that there are objective grounds for making both aesthetic judgments and for me, far more consequential moral judgments. Just briefly about aesthetics, to me, it seems that first and foremost, we want to produce a kind of experience, a rich aesthetic experience. Nabokov says, how can you tell that you're in the grip of an aesthetic experience? It's because the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, sort of hirsute salute, right? That he didn't say that, I said that, that's but it sounds Nabokov. And that there's a kind of experience that pulls you out of yourself. There's a kind of attention, and attention is very, very important here. An attention that pulls you out of yourself. The philosophers often spoke of this attention as a disinterested kind of attention. That is your painful attention to something that doesn't revolve around yourself, and it is in fact, the self is sometimes obliterated. When you're in the midst of this kind of experience, you can lose sense of the passage of time. And it's very enjoyable. It's a very pleasurable thing. This could give us some grounds, this kind of attention. Oh, and I should also say that, it could give us some grounds for talking about better and worse works of art. How intense is the aesthetic experience? Does it repay your attention? Is it true that the more attention you pay to this work, the more experience you're going to have, and so you come back to it. A great novel is not a novel that you get a pleasure from the first time you read it. You get pleasure the second and the third and the fourth time that you read it. So every year, for example, I reread Proust, and every year there's more pleasure to be gotten from it. So there's something there, some grounds, and maybe we could even, find some neuroscience description of what's going on when that kind of attention is being paid. There are some who have argued, Kant, for example, argued that this kind of aesthetic disinterestedness has a lot to do with the moral point of view, because the moral point of view also demands of us that we place ourselves in perspective, that it's not all self-interested, that it is a somewhat selfless point of view. I would say that there are affinities between these, basically what I just said, but I think that's about as far as it goes. I don't think that the aesthetic kind of experience is necessary or is sufficient for the moral point of view. I've known some great artists who were real bastards, right? They clearly could produce that experience. They knew what it took. It did not make them moral creatures, because morality has to do with our own interests, our own what we want versus other people in the world. So, but I think that there are objective grounds there too. And I did want to say this whole God thing, the three-letter word has been mentioned, and certainly in Western civilization, the notion of God has gripped our normative judgment, but it's, I think, for very, very deep reasons. One of them being that, the thought that God cares so much about everything that we do confers a great sense of mattering on our lives. I was brought up very religious, clearly, having just gotten the Richard Dawkins Award. I'm no longer. I know what it's like to radically change your mind about these issues. But I was brought up to think, if I took a little nibble of a Hostess Twinkie, these little cupcakes that were very desirable to me in my youth, that God Almighty, the Lord of the hosts, would actually take note and disapprove and remember that I had nibbled on a Hostess Twinkie. It's terrifying, but it certainly confers a great sense of mattering. You cosmically matter to the master of the universe. I don't think that this is, I think that this is a false view, and that it is a kind of almost a normative narcotic, that it's very addictive, that we've been addicted to. But at that point in history, when this Abrahamic vision of what it is that grounds morality and what makes each of us matter was being proposed, there was also some different thoughts going on. I mean, there was Confucianism and Taoism and Hinduism and Buddhism. They all kind of emerged at the same moment of time. The philosopher Karl Jaspers calls this the axial age, because I call it the normative explosion, because all of these normative systems kind of resonate out into our own age, including the thing that the Greeks were propounding, which was not a normative system based on theism, not at all. In fact, Plato has a knockdown, fabulous argument in one of his dialogues, the Euthyphro, that we can't found morality on theism. It's an argument that was put forth by Plato, repeated by Spinoza, repeated by Bertrand Russell, repeated by Sam Harris, who doesn't always give Plato credit for having the original argument as to why theism is really pretty much irrelevant, that we have to ground morality on reason, and that in fact we've been doing this. I agree very much with some of the things that have been said before. I disagree with this whole internal self. You go inside to the dialogue within you, because many of our deepest moral intuitions and moral presuppositions are wrong. And the way that we favor ourselves and our own kind are wrong. And what we need are arguments that eventually show us the inconsistency. So slavery has been mentioned. There were arguments against slavery. It was very, very hard for people to see that slavery was wrong. After all, the Bible endorses slavery. You must not enslave the Israelite, but you can enslave others. The Greeks thought, Plato has an argument, you must not enslave fellow Greeks. Never mind non-Greeks who were called barbarians. It is very, very, if we just stay within are all of these presuppositions, unexamined presuppositions that favor us and our own kind. So what gets us going? There have to be arguments that show a kind of inconsistency between moral convictions we've already endorsed, usually those that apply to our own selves and our own kind, and say, look, if you're going to say that your life matters, you're going to have to confer mattering on others as well. This has been a very long process. We're still in the midst of it. Peter Singer, an Australian philosopher now in Princeton, 30 years ago, proposed this argument that the way we treat animals is absolutely inconsistent with moral principles that we've already endorsed. And we all thought he was kind of flaky, but we studied his argument, and it began to have repercussions. Then they become social movements, and now we all feel guilty about the steak on our plate, right? And I think that, in fact, my grandchildren, should I ever have any, will look back and say, how could we have treated factory farms animals in the way that we do. So, it's not just a matter of going within the self. We need something to provoke us to examine and to get us to change our views about things in the hopes of greater consistency, coherence, including, most importantly, moral coherence.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, that was really interesting, and although I'll never look at the steak on my plate and feel anything other than desire, the key question there in terms of whether these things come from inside or outside, what that actually means, whether outside doesn't necessarily mean a set of rules, whether inside is actually reliable or too self-orientated, those I think are key questions for the weekend as well, but very key for this discussion. So, Paul, as a critic and as an observer on this, your thoughts, please.
Well, I feel a bit like the Neil Patrick Harris character in Gone Girl now, that I've slightly wandered in from the wrong movie. May well end up with my throat being slit, but we'll see. I am going to view this very much as a critic. It's a 20th century construct in my way of thinking. I was a critic in the 20th century. And I took it very seriously, the idea of being a critic, as I started when I was in my teens. I took it very seriously. And my heroes in the world of criticism were the great gods of critics. Your Charles Baudelaire's, your Marshall McLuhan's, your Deleuze's. I really took it seriously that the role of the critic was an important element in the construction of reality that perhaps began with the artist. It needed, or the musician, it needed the greater context that the critic gave to to what was happening, interpreting it, explaining it, amplifying it, relocating it in a way, giving it a different kind of meaning. For me, the critic had poetic aspirations, and I took that very seriously. And oddly enough, as I've got older, I've become more interested in the very idea of being a critic, as much as these days it's a little bit like banging away at horseshoes while everyone's driving around in cars. Because the role of the critic as a kind of elitist, if you like, who do you think you are? It's sort of been supplanted, it's been replaced, obviously, by everybody becoming a kind of critic. The criticism that has sort of replaced my idea of what a critic was is very much just about liking something. I like this, I don't like that. It's part of the process that has reduced the meaning of the music that I used to promote, extravagantly celebrate, love and adore in the late 70s and early 80s into a kind of meaningless mush where everything is now exactly the same because the context has gone. Once the context goes, then there's no difference really between Cheryl Cole and Bob Dylan. Because if you don't have the amplification, the insight, the surrounding elements that enters into the world and hits people's imagination and creates communities, then it's meaningless signals, and it's definitely a case that it's lost its context. And of course, what tends to happen at panels like this, and it often happens when I do these kind of talks, is first of all, there's that awful sense of, oh God, a crisis, another crisis, a crisis in criticism. And there's been a crisis in criticism, I think, for a good, well, probably 2 centuries actually, but recently that's picked up speed. And also that notion that comes across that you're lamenting the good old days, which is actually not what I'm doing. What I'm actually kind of interested in, as someone who believed in the idea of the critic, and the critic also doing something really interesting, which was not just saying I like this or I don't like that, but actually translating something from one language into another. You take a piece of music and you turn it into a piece of writing. That's an act. That's a creative act, and it's not simply saying I like this or I don't like that. You're imagining the work that you're responding to into a greater reality. This is how things enter history. In that sense, pop music's reached a moment just on that narrow little world where it's about to enter history, and the role of the critic would seem to be important in that kind of transformation, as the critic has indeed been reduced to just everybody being a critic. So I kind of think it's interesting that the kind of people I was fascinated by as critics seem to have a role now that there's been such a sort of transformation of the environment. There's been a reprogramming of social life. All those things that the great critics have always talked about. Just at that moment that it's actually really beginning to happen, and everything's beginning to change in such a profound and transcendent way. Rather suspiciously, and I am enough of a Philip K. Dick paranoid to often think this has ideological underpinnings. The critic, the role of the individual critic, self-important, elitist, demanding, dominating, has of course been replaced by everybody being that critic, and that's interesting in the sense of the world always had the popular side, the charts, the way that the popular imagination was represented. They had that. It's interesting now that those that had that also want the critical side as well. They want the other side. They want the side that was traditionally the role of the critic, to support the marginal, the minority, the weird, the avant-garde. That's been sort of railroaded out of the way by those that already had a position of dominance, because they had the popular imagination. They dominated that. So the idea that the critic has been removed has a kind of ideological sense, either intentionally or not. So I was kind of lamenting the fact that just at the moment when the idea of the critic, that tradition of the critic that peaked in a way with the godlike genius of Baudelaire, and then came all the way through to those of us that wrote for The Enemy in the late 1970s, who actually genuinely believed we were Baudelaire and wrote about the bands we wrote about as if there was a Baudelairean impulse to doing so. That kind of critic has gone at the moment when it's most needed, when that kind of diagnosis, that kind of interpretation, defining things, imagining things, constructing things, The idea that everyone seems to have a voice, seems to be saying things, but it's a very passive voice. It's everybody's become familiar with everything, which creates a kind of weird comfort zone. At the moment, we should be the most alert, and the critic was traditionally always the most alert in a kind of society. So, I mean, that's why I felt a little bit like Neil Patrick Harris coming in, from the wrong film. Just that sense that maybe that's not what judgment actually is. But I always held it to be true. Even if I was reviewing, a minor pop group, I felt that the fact that I was reading into it something maybe over-subtle, over-sophisticated, over-nuanced, in fact represented a greater truth, that there was a greater truth, and that it was the role of the critic to find that greater truth. And that puts reality itself in context, and it puts, what is happening to reality at the moment in context. The critic, for me, at the very best, doesn't just say, I like this, I don't like that. They actually put things into context, whether that's a 3-minute pop single or reality itself. And that involves making a series of judgments. And at the moment, it is interesting as a critic. Why my role has been replaced is that I've been replaced by what I call the underneathers, the commenters, who, if I have an opinion and an idea, which is a tender thing, an idea takes many, many years to unfold and become itself, it's immediately ripped apart by those that assume that the critic, I mean, for me, the critic is as skillful as a surgeon. So it is quite interesting when you try and apply an act of surgery, that the underneathers, the commenters, kind of come in and basically just lop off a leg when you've actually been trying very, very hard to save the leg. And again, of course, that implies elitism, condescension. Who do I think I am to be that one person? And that seems to be what really upsets the underneathers. But there is a reason why you believe in yourself as a critic, and it isn't simply to give something 4 out of 5 stars.
No, you haven't wandered into the wrong movie, because that was exactly what we were talking about, so that's very good. And actually, you get on quite well with Angus, and you should read his book, because he says a lot of that too. That was actually a very good reflection. No, that's actually a very good reflection, I think, on some of the problems, and it's entirely to say, as you've just pointed out, that it's not to go the good old days, but because something's happened, and something's going on, and so that's quite important.
Well, it's to say, what is the good old future going to be?
Indeed. Couple of strands before I go out, quick. I wanted to ask, first of all, Rebecca, actually, on the objective, subjective question, one of the things that I think is a problem in terms of people exercising their organ of judgment as much as anything, can be what looks to be a kind of reliance on objective criteria. Yeah. And this is particularly true if you want in the tension sometimes between philosophy and science, for example. So we will say, well, and even just to use a more banal example in education, which is that you can no longer read an essay anymore as an educator and say that's a kind of A minus. There's a kind of criteria, a set of 40 things that you have to tick boxes. And this, if they get 35, they get an A. If they get, even though you're reading something that only ticks 7 boxes and you know it's an A, and another time something that ticks 39 out of 40 boxes and you know it's rubbish and it's a C. But you're not allowed to say that because that's you being subjective. So is there a danger in the way we understand that look outside to objective criteria of actually making judgment redundant and so on?
Right. Yeah. I mean, to say that there really are some objective criteria here in both aesthetics, but in morality as well, in ethics as well, is not to say that we are good at telling when we're being objective. We're very, very bad at that. And that's why we need one another. That's why I think the internal dialogue is not the way to go. Plato wrote dialogues, and he was telling us something philosophically important there, which is if we stay in our own minds, we are not going to expose all, our deepest prejudices to others, and it's very, very hard to root them out, especially when they're held by our society in general. I remember that Socrates was executed by his fellow Athenians. He obviously said something that went very, very counter to the society. There is a kind of false objectivity right now that's being promoted in the name of science. I think that scientific evidence always has to be taken into account. Whatever our best theories of the moment are telling us about the nature of the world, of ourselves, our brains, us and the world, is all evidence, is all fodder. It all has to be, I have no tolerance, I have to say, for philosophers who don't keep abreast of the latest things in science. But there are a lot of questions that are outside of the domain of science, including, what's the importance of science? Is science telling us what's true? Is science eliminating the self because we can't find that self on the neuroscientific basis? And that itself is not something that science can answer for us. That requires a different kind of reason, a different kind of intelligence. I'd call it philosophical intelligence.
Okay, great. Angus wants to come in, and then I'm going to come to John.
I'm not sure about the sort of inability to look within and get the right answer on moral judgments. I mean, I think the Greeks were pretty sure that slavery was bad, at least for themselves. And they could look within to work that out on the basis of right reason alone. And I'm just not quite so comfortable with, or not as qualified to easily dismiss sort of Kantian morality. But I am quite sure that he said something interesting about aesthetics as well. And I think that's not an objective area. I think Paul's really right about the sort of validity of criticism, that it's not objective and it's not subjective. And it's not universal. But it's representative. I mean, it's a faculty of the human imagination put into the widest context that you can place around it. That's where Kant must be right about aesthetics. It's a certain denial of egoism that's involved in taste, because to get to a good aesthetic judgment, you're trying to take into account everybody else's view, and there's a certain historical representation there. And it's a faculty of the human imagination. That's why the playing God thing, I think, is really important, and what, John, you were saying about the measure out to infinite perfection. Because, Rebecca, sometimes you seem to be taking God too seriously, but also not seriously enough. In the ability to play God seems to me a faculty of the human imagination, and we want, we want lots of that.
Trying to be objective is to say, what would God say, or this is God's point of view. It's a metaphor. Physicists use this all the time. Einstein used this language all the time, and so did Stephen Hawking at the end of A Brief History of Time. And both of them had to go back and correct the false impression that they really were theists. This is a kind of metaphor for objectivity, the God talk.
John, I wanted to actually just go on to Angus looking down and kind of God question as well. It's not even to get, but I do think that one of the interesting issues for me is that in some ways religion denies your ability to make judgment because it does it for you. I mean, strictly speaking, you could say that 10 commandments, you just do what you're told. There's a kind of objective that therefore you can sort of blame the objective. Oh, well, I have to do this because I have to follow a certain. I just finished reading in McEwen's book, the Children's Act, and it's how do you work this out if you're following this kind of prescriptive path, and that actually man should put herself in the place of God, and that's a very different question. Yeah. But on the other hand, there does seem to be a crisis of judgment in the absence of something that's more meaningful than biology. So if you could play around with that.
Well, okay. I think that, just very briefly to answer this question, to start with, the headline in relation to this religion thing, I mean, I do think that was true in the way everything in religion is reduced for public consumption, for mass consumption. But when you actually take the rule and go into it, generally speaking, in my experience, even though I am determined to continue breaking the rule, I can always see the logic of the rule when I get there, right? But there was a case in Ireland, this kind of case comes up very frequently, but I remember this particular one because I wrote about it, and of the particular circumstances. A young boy who was, in a vegetative state, or they said, the hospital said, in a hospital on a life support machine, was the subject of a court proceeding in Ireland. And his parents wanted to take the child away to America or Japan or someplace, I can't remember, for a treatment which they believed gave him a chance. The hospital he was a ward of court, and the hospital were effectively his parents, for legal purposes, wanted to simply switch off the machine. Now the judge, who's a decent, compassionate, man, and not a bad judge, he said two things which I found extraordinary. One was that he said he had to put himself in the position of this boy, and on the other, he had to listen to the evidence. And the evidence, such as it was entirely from so-called experts, who were the doctors representing the hospital who wanted to turn off the machine. And so much of his judgment comprised, statements from these doctors. And yet he was claiming to put himself in the position of the boy. Now, I don't think it's actually possible for him to put himself in the position of the boy. I wouldn't be able to do that myself. I think the grave danger is that I might put myself in the situation of somebody unable to look at the boy. And that's a really dangerous thing for a judge to be. And I think that's where we can, this idea of the objective and the subjective. What is it? What is it? Obviously, there is only one locus of decision making, and that is the self, the subjective person. Ultimately, the judge is in here, and the book stops somewhere at some deep part of the human person. Whether you're talking about music, whether you're talking about morals, it doesn't matter. Now, you process, obviously, all kinds of information to do that. That's the point. But you are working against some kind of idealized notion of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is beautiful, what is ugly, and so on. And so ultimately, what we're talking about, and I know the God thing, can become highly distracting. It's a terrible word. I mean, if I could come up with a different word, I would. But really, we're talking about first causes. That the things which happened before we knew anything, the things which happened before the point at which we began to know things about. Because we are structurally defined by these moments, whether we realize it or not, whether it's not. And what Paul is talking about, I think, is I always get the impression reading Paul's work, that's what he's trying to deal with, that he leaves no limit. He goes back beyond that point in writing about music, about a pop song. He says, I want to read a quote which I was going to use in my thing, but I didn't want to embarrass him. And I think it sort of makes my point, and I don't attribute any meaning to any word other than what's here. He's talking about the pop song, which is the words disappearing into themselves as though boiled down, as if they were changing from solid to liquid, forming a sensuous, absorbing musical form that implies how all music began with the human voice. The sound of the human voice imitating sounds around us, the sounds of nature, animals, even the sound of silence, the sound of the human voice copying the voice of God. That's a sentence which, to me, means all kinds of things. But it can mean all kinds of other kind of things in the ears or the eyes of anybody else. But that's kind of what we are leaving out if we try to build a construct devoid of this first causes idea. Because we build an air. Even if we start with the Greeks, we're building an air.
Sorry, I know I'm being rude now, but I'm just going to say, right. Paul, and then I'm out. And then I'll start with Angus first when I come back. So, Paul, I just wanted to ask you, because one of the things that I don't understand myself about all of this is, on the one hand, I'm very wary about experts making decisions on my behalf. Yeah. I'm using the introduction, the kind of ban of smoking, she says with her cigarettes in hand, ban of smoking in parks, but the kind of the bossy experts who come and tell you, and the abdication of judgment as a consequence. And yet, on the other hand, I utterly defend, say, for example, criticism as against kind of opinion bloggers. And it seems to me that everyone's got an opinion, but but I don't want to hear them all, to be honest. And there are some opinions that are more important than others. So but I don't know, but I feel like I'm contradicting myself. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? That it is full of contradictions. And I mean, it was interesting just reading out that little bit of stuff that apparently I once wrote. I imagine that now going into a mainstream media newspaper, and underneath my skin will be flailed off. Yeah. I would be burnt at the stake, you know. When I had ideas, and all the people I love had ideas before this particular period in history, which I think is really important to consider because it is a complete transformation of everything. You had ideas. I mean, I always thought of the critic and the judge being quite a private thing and very antisocial, as you probably have noticed from my behaviour lately. Is that the notion that somehow this new social world of communities and sharing and the conversation, which absolutely tears me apart every time it comes up on Sky News or The One Show or Newsnight, the conversation. It's something I never thought be thinking about either. The idea of return to the godlike elitist, to even an A&R man, for God's sake. You know, most pop music now, you realise what's wrong with it. It's actually not finished because there's no ridiculous. We used to think they were fascistic and awful, and we built a whole independent movement against the idea of the record industry. But you suddenly realise it's part of a greater need, a greater kind of series of things that everything has to go through to actually have real worth, other than it just being, and it just being the same as everything else. Mm-hmm. So I'm also surprised to find myself, using this language, which sometimes has the worst people imaginable coming up to me and patting me on the back and saying they agree with me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what have I become?
Okay, I'll bring you in first. Sorry, just because. Because I've got already hands, I know it's my fault. So there's that gentleman there, and then just let's start, then go right to the very back after that then, please.
I'd like to challenge the whole premise of this. I think we don't live in an era of, I think we live in an era of black and white judgment, and I should know, as anyone who's male, white and heterosexual knows that we are in effect persona non grata, and these various other folk groups, I don't need to list them, are in effect beyond criticism. And this dates back, and I know this is obviously the elephant in the room for the Institute of Ideas being a post-Marxist group, but it's rooted in this whole idea of the workers didn't rise up, they blame the workers workers have been retrospectively stereotyped as male, white and heterosexual. The history of this is well known. Frank Vertical, I won't elucidate it. If you Google the origin of identity politics and political correctness, you'll get my big referenced essay on this. Okay, but anyway, all right. What's happened then is, to support that, obviously, because there's no internal consistency for it, so to support this whole idea, then they end up with postmodern ideas, then you get this non-judgmentalism. So really, you need to look underneath it. Underneath it, we've got the opposite of non-judgment. We've got this black and white judgment.
Regardless of some of the things that were said there, I think that idea of the black and white, that judgmentalism, we all recognise that at the same time as a crisis of judgment, so fair point.
I think I absolutely agree with Paul Morley that something has changed and that everyone now is a critic. And insofar as I understood anything of what John said, his first statement about the increase of judgmentalism and of being judgmental and the decrease of judgment is also, I think, true. But what's interesting about, I think, the bottom third of the internet, which is what you're talking about, is how far actually it seems to reflect the desire for people to close down a debate and actually limit your ability to judge and discriminate and make arguments. And in fact, it's almost as if they want to have a badge of honour of how moral they can be in disagreeing with you and how far they can show that they conform to perhaps an established point of view. And that seems to be the trend, certainly, with the increase of the rogue critic, of everyone being a critic. I'm currently, just to show off for a minute in front of everyone, currently reading the Iliad. And there's quite an interesting thing, I think, that you realise about reading that, is that the Greeks believed in competing gods. They believed that there wasn't one god, that there were lots of gods all fighting each other and determining human history. And while I wouldn't necessarily think that we should go back to a pantheistic view, actually the idea of us having competing gods, as it were, that our God, my God, your God, that we can fight to the death, so to speak, over what we believe is the truth, is actually something that's worth resurrecting, if anything.
Hi. I just wanted to say I loved the point you made about taking a piece of music and turning it into a piece of writing, and that, was what criticism was about. That was just an aside. I just had a question, because today it seems to me that the point that you made about nothing ever being judged in context anymore, obviously there's lots of examples of that in terms of all the DJs that have been going through the courts recently and the whole Savile thing, and the whole 70s being put under a spotlight of today. And it just made me think, and I suppose it relates back to what the gentleman over there was saying, is, what is today's context? Because we seem to be unravelling the context of yesterday, but we don't seem to have a context that exists for today.
Yeah, I'm interested in the sort of the dilemma of external, internal, objective, subjective, and I just want to focus a little bit on the external sense of beauty and morality, because that requires a sort of community of judgment, it seems to me, to make the social sides of ourselves, social life, sort of worthwhile almost. You need that community sense of judgment. So that implies and you need it because you want a subjective transcendence, a sort of breaking, what you called about being pulled out of your everyday experience, Rebecca. You know, you want to be pulled out of your everyday experience. You want, you know, your desire is to be transcend, isn't it? So, how do you get there? How do you get that when you've got this community judgment? Well, you need critics. You need people that you can listen to. You need people that you can follow and relate to. So it seems to me that's where the role of judgment as a critic is. And I just wonder whether the panel see that sort of sense of transcendence leading and a sense of being led as part of that mix.
It's a comment really for Paul. I was just thinking about your view on the role of the critic, and you know, if you really think about sort of the beginnings of criticism, particularly I'm interested in literary criticism, that critics from
Speak slightly more.
sorry,
Yeah,
Dr. Johnson to Leavis actually did have a fairly disconnected view and were coming from quite a specific sort of position, and that I would argue, rather than there being a crisis in criticism, I mean, I know you're particularly talking about the music industry, but in cultural criticism generally, the sort of movements of the last 20, 30 years, I would say have made those things richer and fuller in terms of issues of class or gender or post-colonial criticism. So I was just wondering about what areas you saw the crisis occurring, really, and that whether you don't see any value in those newer movements rather than the kind of classic critic that tends towards canonicity and a very sort of slightly idiosyncratic view of culture very often.
Okay, so Rebecca made an appeal to scientific evidence and how it can inform debates like this and philosophical debates, and sort of scientific evidence has been notably absent from the conversation, and I would just move that that's an important part of the discussion, I think, informing the discussion. One of the things that we've learned, and there are many nuanced and interesting ideas from psychology, but if we've learned nothing else, we've learned that the human brain, the human mind to an extent, is judgmental by design. We didn't evolve to become philosopher kings, we evolved to survive. And so deep deliberation is computationally extraordinarily expensive. Evolution designed us to act immediately in order to survive, not to think and to get in groups and to sit in cinemas and expend huge amounts of glucose that we didn't have on the African savannah. And as an example, for this and many, many reasons, I think the subject about judgmentalism and judgment is well informed by understanding, you know, the substrate through which thoughts extend.
Okay, thank you. Angus, pick anything up.
Well, isn't Paul exactly right about that sort of strange reversal of fortune in which, you know, oppositional movements, people who tried to pick their friends wisely, I think that's a key part of judgment, is saying, I want to associate it with these sort of people, these sorts of opinions, because I think they're the right sort of people and those are the wrong ones. When that goes, you do end up with this sort of world of indifference to each other, which I think is the greatest problem of non-judgmentalism. It's the mush that Paul's talking about. You fall into that world in which we don't matter to each other, except perhaps as you know, molecules and glucose. And you do get into this very weird change of bedfellows where, you know, Rebecca was tortured with religious prescription against eating cupcakes. Not that I've found that in the Bible, but today's health police say don't eat the Hostess Twinkie because it's bad for your glucose levels, and they're absolutely, maybe even more intolerant than the religious tradition of a certain amount of self-denial and abstinence. And we get into this thing where the conversation idea, get everybody in, everybody agree, eclipses judgment, eclipses human subjectivity, eclipses real difference of opinion, right? And it's through that conflict that judgments matter on the world, I think. They're representative, as I'm arguing. They don't have objective validity, but you try, Kant's phrase, to woo the consent of as many right-minded people as you can, and you determine that. And you know, sometimes you're right. The representative word I throw in and emphasize because it should rightly remind us of the process of democracy, right, as well. Representative and common sense, relying on common sense, is a very important part of tradition, which precludes the role of the expert, the Socrates, the moral expert, who would tell the demos of Athens what was right. And that was profoundly unrepresentative, right at the beginning of a tradition. Last thought, I mean, John's point about the difficulty of the God word, exactly. I mean, the best replacement for the God word is freedom. which is man, which is the human subjectivity. That's the replacement for the God word, because the first mover in all this, the prime mover, is human agency. That's what comes first, the possibility of our freedom. That's what underpins the possibility of human judgment. And that's what the whole problem we're dealing with is when we rely too much on so-called expertise, we deny our individual freedom.
Okay, thanks. Paul, anything you want to pick up?
I think that thing about shutting down a debate argument, the potential for things to uncurl and unfold and develop into something is part of what McLuhan, was always talking about back in the 60s, about the numbing that there often is when these kind of great historic moments happen and the electronic transformations. There's a numbing that goes on because people can't quite cope with the severe alteration there's been to their environment and their conditions. And I think that also goes to the same thing about that thing that at a time like this, it's what's immediately behind us becomes the most vivid, and people are very nostalgic in all sorts of ways for the hardware age, and that transmitting of opinion about that thing that happened with DJs, whether as repulsive as Savile or as irritating as all DJs are anyway, is interesting in terms of the way that things are interpreted without any real sort of development and adjustment and enriching of the fact that we're in a different time, a different space, and we need a new language, new categories, new conditions. And I think in terms of what was said about the development of criticism, I am of course generalizing. I think one of the most important thing a great critic does, which the underneathers, the commenters, I think we had an underneather earlier, I might be wrong, never seen one in person because they never come out in the light. It's quite interesting that. I wanted to set up one of these, and I just wanted to invite all the underneathers that had burnt me to a crisp, and I don't think anybody turned up. But it is interesting, I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, in terms of the development of new criticism, absolutely. But isn't it interesting in a really sophisticated times in terms of the technology, the weird obedience that there is to us, the slavery. This is a new form of slavery, the kind of craving almost to subject, yourself to the conditions of being controlled. And I know when I start to use that kind of language, it's usually when I get burnt to a crisp. But it is interesting that just as that's happening, it's very difficult to actually start to talk about those kind of things because the underneathers come in and slit your throat. But I think obviously there are always new, the whole point is the creative urges still exist. One of the depressions I have is that they've not manifested themselves too well in this new world yet. It's filled with nostalgia for the previous worlds. I'm interested in how the creative urges will fit these new worlds. But yes, there is fantastic new kinds of criticism. But it is interesting that the things that are being talked about this week, especially with rape, the Ebola crisis, still seem to be using standards that seem 50, 60 years out of date. And so that the technology has moved on, but not, and it's absorbed everything from the 20th century to use as raw material and as fodder for people to consume. But what hasn't been brought into that world is the great thinking.
One thing I thought it was interesting about the community of judgment, because one of the things that it strikes me about the subjective, about moving from being an underneather than having confidence in your own judgment, is that actually what really I think judgment can mean is that you do think, I think this is a great piece of music or a great novel, and I'm not a literary critic or a music critic, but that you actually take responsibility then for trying to persuade others of that. And and therefore you can't just go beyond, I like it, what do you mean, right? And so I think but that requires an atmosphere where you can be shot down because you haven't got any validity for saying it's a great novel because it's a rubbish novel, and other people say no, and you have to take that on board. One of my problems with new criticism that was mentioned about, well, we've now developed, we have more class insight, class insight, gender insight and so on and so forth, is that sometimes these things just get boxed off. So basically, you actually say, well, what about the gender perspective? It's not a requirement that you have to go through everything. You make your criticism and you have to persuade people. You can say, well, you've forgotten to mention the gender thing. You can't say that because you haven't mentioned the gender question or because you haven't gone through or it doesn't take into account post-colonial ideas. They have no more, I don't care. I just want it to be a good piece of criticism and then you'll join in. Because I think that what's happened is that's constrained us. And people feel they can't speak about something because what right have I to say that because I'm not from a post-colonial perspective? And that's been a shutting down aspect that I think has been helpful.
I hear what Rebecca said about we need each other to have that dialogue, to cross-examine. The question I'm really interested in is how can we judge more wisely? We live in a very connected world. How do we consolidate very different, many opinions? And, whose judgment do we listen to? Is it the expert, the more vocal, the people who access to speak their minds and be heard? How do we consolidate that and judge more wisely? That's what really interests me.
I don't think my point will be as eloquently put as everybody else's, but I'll try. I think it reflects that lady's point and also what you were just saying, is one of the issues with judgment that we're discussing due to the devaluing of expertise. I've heard from nearly all the people on the panel the use of phrases such as the so-called experts, the scientific community, but very little discussion of the scientific method, which is a way of reaching... It's a way of reaching judgments regarding certain real-world situations in which there is a known body of facts and a judgment is possible if, depending on the outcome you're looking for. So I just wondered whether it's difficult that this has become a discussion of judgment, subjective judgment, but it's not actually looking at the value of objective judgment and the methods to reach it.
Well, you've certainly got to the heart of one of the things that we think the festival is going to be looking at. I'm actually rather glad that we have gone counterintuitively against the experts myself, but there we go.
Yeah, I just want to comment on moral judgment. It seems to me it's okay to make moral judgments, but you need to be very explicit about where you're coming from. And in particular, two bases for your moral judgments. The first will be a kind of metaphysic. I use that word in the broad sense. In other words, your view of reality. What is reality? And that base, it does seem to me, has a degree of objectivity. It can be tested. You can say this view of reality has more substance, consistency, or whatever than this other view of reality. But that's only one base. The other base will be an a priori value judgment. And I don't know where you get that from. That is essentially a very personal issue. But again, you need to be explicit about it. What is this value basis you're coming from and the reality basis you're coming from to make the judgment?
The title of this is Why Are We Afraid to Judge? That's because some people don't want us to judge. They think they'll be the losers if the judgment goes the wrong way. This is politics versus rational discussion, science-based, evidence-based discussion. And the people who say rape is rape is rape, a lot of them are women who frightened they might be raped. It's about their survival. People who say racism is racism are ethnic minorities who are frightened of being discriminated against. People who say anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism are Jews who are frightened of what might happen to them, and so on. This is about their instantaneous issues of survival. It is pro-Darwinian. It is the correct way for them to look at it. It's political. They do not want evidence because it might be against their interests.
Okay, thank you for that.
I like how the guy who just said that you need to identify where you're coming from in making a contribution didn't identify where he was coming from. And maybe that shows that it would just take too much time, and therefore people need to judge without that. Rebecca makes a point that judgment needs to be grounded in reason. Surely, Rebecca, when we're called to judge, there's no time for that in many instances. And I was also wondering, in your discussion of Peter Singer's move from the margins to the mainstream, you identified how it became a social movement. How would you reason that? Because some people would say that's an example of unreason and anti-humanism.
I'm interested in the thinking about how we'll judge in the future and the particular experience of having a 13-year-old son. I'm interested in the debates about education and how we teach some of these values and thoughts. I'm really, really struggling with my 13-year-old son in terms of he absolutely refuses to read. So he will not read books. And what does that mean for the future? He's not an unintelligent person, but I do worry. As part of my campaign of blackmail at the moment, he is required to read Animal Farm. That's his latest book that he's supposed to read. Absolutely refused to pick it up. So as part of the bribery, the reward for reading it at the end of half term next week will be the purchase of FIFA 15. And that has really, really motivated him. I hate every bit of this. I loathe it.
He's reading a page a day at the moment. It's really, really boring, Mum. Although yesterday he did come in and say the pigs have gone mental now, Mum. So he's getting a little bit more into it. But the idea of what the future is, without reading, without philosophy, without thinking, without everything that I assume everyone in this room is intelligent. And it's this measure of intelligence and what we're going to do with this in the future that I find worrying.
The whole room went out to you there, and the teenagers who were 16 looked slightly embarrassed about the fact that they were like that a few years ago, but they're here now, so, you know, who knows? John, picking up anything?
Yeah, the question there came from how do you reason these things? Well, it's a big thing. I mean, that's a big question and it's a big process. It's actually true that, you know, responding to things on the hoof, human beings don't actually do that as a rule. They tend to do something and then construct a post-rationalization for it. That's not what judgment is. Judgment needs to be something removed, and it's a much slower process. And that's probably where the key to this is, that we've actually, in our faster moving society, lost the capacity to actually have that as a dominant theme, to actually know that you have to do that, you know, you can't just simply, because we are still reacting to the guy who was reacting to somebody else, you know. So, and that's something I just wanted to go on about a bit, because, you see, for example, the question about science, and it's a very good one, but the problem, I was at a conference of scientists in Italy there during the summer, and this is a really strong theme about the way that science is reported, generally. And all the scientists there had a real problem with the fact that the language which they use, which has particular meanings, cannot be translated into a language of the newspaper, of the TV, of the internet. So that the understandings we have of what's actually going on, what's about to happen, what's about to break, are actually completely wrong. And certain scientists take advantage of this for their career. You know, they make a feisty impact to kind of get publicity by saying things which might happen, but actually probably if they do ever happen, will not happen in our lifetimes or for a long time afterwards. But if you say it, I mean, if you say, for example, that there is no self, and you keep asserting it in a time when you know it can't be disproven, then you become a causaler. Now, the question of the internet is really interesting, and I think this goes to the whole point of judgment. What Paul is talking about is what I was talking about at the beginning, judgment based on the person, you know, as a response to reality, a total response of the human person from the point of their putative origin to the point of their putative destination. That they take in every possibility and everything that is not possible. And that's what writing was. But the problem is with the online thing, that's not possible anymore. You see, writing in that old way is a kind of a relationship. You have a relationship with something, some person, some entity. And I think of it as the page. You have a relationship with the page. The page represents something. But when you have a relationship with a screen, there's a whole, you know, a gaggle of monsters hiding behind that screen. And the thing with the online thing is there's no risk. If you go online, most of the people online, they don't risk. What's happening to writing and thinking in our public culture now is that risk is being excluded, is being closed down. Because who would take a risk? And I'm not talking about a risk about saying something controversial necessarily. I'm actually talking about the risk of exposing yourself, exposing your heart and your soul in some way that you can count on the relationship you have constructed with your readers to do, but you can't count on the guys who are waiting just to react to somebody this morning, because their bollocks is itchy and they just got out of bed and they want to do something. And this is the kind of problem we have. And what Paul says is actually, I think this is a kind of a real point, of a tipping point now, where our culture could change. Nicholas, can I just say one thing? Nicholas Carr, in his brilliant book, The Shallows, talks about the effect of the internet on the reader, that, you know, it's basically abolishing our memory span. But I would actually talk about it something else, the effect of the internet on the writer. Because I would actually not write certain things now in a newspaper, because of these assholes who are below the line. And not because they're controversial in the normal sense, or risky in that normal sense, but because they are part of me that I don't want to show to assholes.
Right, okay.
Somebody in the audience said the people that say rape is rape are women that are afraid of being raped. I don't think that's true. I think they're people that are afraid of prejudice. And I'm interested in the relationship between judgment and prejudice. Can the panel comment on it, because I think it's at the core of this discussion?
That's very good and important, and I think it's going to come up a bit.
It's just the idea of democratisation represented by online media, because if anyone can have a go and say what they think, then it comes down to how do you win authority for what you're saying. And I think that you really can't decide who's going to go online and say their bit and whether it's going to be any good. And the idea that moderators are going to filter out the crap isn't going to work either. So I think in terms of putting up with rubbish and people responding in a negative and unhelpful way that doesn't say anything interesting, it's just something you have to suck up and put up with. And it really comes down to sort of being able to work out who's able to make sense and give insight. And they're the people who will win authority, and they're the ones who you'll pay attention to. And the rest, unfortunately, you just have to put up with them.
Final thought, John.
There's just two words I'd like to put out, and they've come up imagination. Imagination is, I think, the good word. It's the word that actually describes all this stuff. It's the word that's actually at the top. That's what we're trying to fill out, because whether we're talking about God or law or truth or any of these things, they're in this thing called imagination. And it's not that we make things up; we discover things in imagination, and that's what an imagination is. It's about knowing the totality of being in the world, and that's what I think judgment is. And how we fill that out is we can use all kinds of tools, like the way you write a book or write a play. You construct it from all kinds of rubbish to start with, but you start to build it into a coherent shape. The bad word that I would actually say, and I think this goes to almost everything we've been talking about, the internet, of all that, and it's a strange word, but it's a word that comes up in Eichmann all the time: obedience. That if you are obedient, that obedience sounds like a good word. We were taught it was a good word, but it's actually a bad word. If you start doing what people tell you just because they're telling you, then you're probably on the wrong path already. Judgment involves, seeing through what people tell you is true. Judgment involves going in, bringing with you all the evidence, but filtering it to some kind of inner mechanism that we know is there, because we know it's right. We know what the human good is. We know when we're being assholes. We know when we're actually doing the right thing. We know when we're doing the wrong thing. We know when it's far more complicated than that. We can see ourselves doing the wrong thing, telling ourselves we're doing the right thing. We can we can watch ourselves doing something which looks good, but we know why we're doing it because we've got a bad motive. We know all that stuff. But this is all part of judgment. And what's actually happened to our culture is all this has been reduced. All the part, just as with writing, all the skills of writing, the art of writing has been removed in public sphere now because of the internet. All the paradox, the puns, the ironies, everything is being washed out of it. And all that is being dealt with is superficial content. That's really bad for judgment, because that brings us back to Eichmann. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it has to be said, after you've read Rebecca's book, if you haven't read it, it is true. Forget Animal Farm, it's Hannah Arendt every time. But Eichmann in Jerusalem, this is the book that you should read, and it was to commend John for mentioning it. Okay, Angus, please.
I very much agree that nostalgia is quite a bad thing, but all traditions are not necessarily a good thing, and sometimes we could even be a bit more relaxed about prejudice, I think. Prejudgments that you can rely on in times of extremism, in extremists, is a case for reaching back to some of those things and just being a bit more tolerant, I think, of what's too easily dismissed as other people's throwback ideas, or that's not appropriate for the 21st century, don't you know? We could learn quite a lot from accumulated prejudice, if you like. Because I think the really big problem is indifference and that hypersensitivity to other people, that sort of awful game you play is that I know that you're different, but I'm going to pretend that you're not. And it boils down to fear of oneself. The root of the fear of ability to judge today, I think, must rest in a fear of oneself and a fear of one's freedom, a denial to embrace that sort of wonderful accidental miracle of simply the being here that creates a world. So I would sort of end with a call for voluntarism, to get up on mountaintops, make yourself more present in the world, elbow your way into the world, because otherwise, you and your judgment end up not mattering. You risk becoming matter, just a thing that doesn't matter, if you don't embrace your freedom, which enables judgment on the world, even if it has no basis. If freedom has no basis itself, there's nothing underneath it, it does have that scary, slippery, indeterminate quality. But unless you skate on it, unless you stand on mountaintops, you will be ignored. And if you stand on mountaintops, others might too.
Thank you very much, Angus. Paul?
Well, I guess sometimes it doesn't come down so much as the book versus the audio-visual sort of object. It's still ultimately, which, that might change. We have obviously a sentimentality for the idea of the book. This might be a moment when we disappear into a different sort of metaphor, a different sort of imagination, and it might be creative resistance versus domestication. I mean, at the moment there's domestication. Your son really has been domesticated. He's been enslaved. It's ideological. There's very little opposition to that, very little creative resistance to that at the moment, not least because it is very comforting. But also, as we've been implying, it's very difficult to stand up and start to make an argument, a case against it, whatever, without being torn apart. Hence the confusion that even though we live in an age of everybody being a critic, we have no criticism as such. And for me, and this goes for education, and it goes for just about everything, and I can't believe it's not happening, and I guess somehow we have to make it happen in terms of also what you were saying, we just have to suck it up, which is, for me, possibly the last stage towards a kind of 21st century fascism. So I look forward to that with interest. Or maybe I'll land before that happens, which is another way of thinking about it. But it is awful because, to me, in terms of prejudice as well, this for me, the ultimate act of a great piece of criticism, the opening of minds, the celebration of the imagination, creates the kind of individuals that would not be that kind of prejudice. Those kind of prejudices often come because they have turned away from the imagination. They are very black and white. And I suppose what I'm yearning for in my private, antisocial little corner of the world that I'm hoping will become increasingly anonymous, because of course anonymity is the new fame, is for new categories in education. People taught different things. We're still taught things that come from the 19th century. It seems astounding. Younger people have no interest in these categories and these grooves and these genres and these nostalgic urges that come from another time completely, even before the hardware age, let alone the software age. I want new categories, and I want new categories in the way critics fit in. I don't want to see music criticised the way it is, cinema criticised the way it is, literature criticised the way it is, in the same old boxes. There's new boxes, there's shifts in those boxes, there's new areas that should be talked about. The fact you keep being stopped, being able to develop an argument is a fascinating instance of the modern world.
Well, I want to address science. I actually come from a background in science, and I'm a philosopher of science. That's what I do. There are two kinds of questions that really concern us humans, and just about all of us. What is and what matters? These are the two kinds of questions that we want answers to, and that one way or the other, even if it's underdetermined by the evidence, we reach conclusions about. What is those questions? I would argue, although it takes a philosophical argument, I would argue that science is our best way of answering that, because science is this really nifty trick. Took quite a few millennia for it to be worked out. The Greeks didn't have it because they didn't have the notion of experimentation. Science is this fantastic thing that we finally landed on, which is to try to get reality to answer us back when we're getting it wrong. And so we can't just go with, and it seems perfectly obvious to us, for example, that simultaneity is absolute. It doesn't matter which frame of reference, moving fast in relationship to each other. You measure simultaneity, you'll get the same answer. Intuitively obvious. Well, we tested it, it's reality says, nature says, we'll just see about that. Poof, special relativity, right? And which corrects our intuitions. And so as far as what the answers to what is, look to science, and these are our best answers, including what we are, that we are neuronal activity. But there's also this question of, what matters? Do we matter? If we do premise our own mattering and just find me the person who doesn't, or just find me the person who lives his or her life without assuming that he or she matters, what else is entailed by that? As somebody had said, we're not very good at thinking out the implications of our own attitudes, presuppositions, premises, intuitions. And there, too, we needed a methodology, and there exists such a methodology. And it's taken a lot of work to get where we are. Community of judgment, that can't do it. All of our social progress have come from moral revolutionaries, starting with Socrates, Spinoza, Erasmus, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. These were people who went against their society and said, you're getting something wrong. And it did take not just arguments. And the argument against slavery, for example, I used to think it was, look, the Bible condones it. Every place on earth had chattel slavery. And I used to think it was John Locke who first put forth the first argument. Then I thought it was Montesquieu. I've actually traced it back 150 years before Montesquieu, Jean Bautain, who had the first argument. Everybody ignored him, but it was that first argument. Look, the concept of a human being, the notion that you're using to make your own claims on how people should teach you is inconsistent with the notion of slavery. It did take, it took novels, it took songs, it took the emotions, it took a social movement, but reason prevailed because there was an inherent inconsistency there. I know I have to wrap up. I just want to answer one question of Angus. Why was a Hostess Twinkie unkosher? Have you ever heard of the shortening called lard?
There we go. Problem solved.